All right, I'll get started. Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me here. It's my first time in this privacy forum. Usually talking more in the infrastructure or security forum. So let's see how this goes. Um, and if people who are live here have questions, feel free to use chat, try to have a look, or ask, of course, live. Tina, can we see my screen? Can you confirm?
Yeah,
Looks good.
I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just confirm. All right, so uh, quick intro about myself. I guess I should start there. Um, so I'm Varun. I'm the founder for Tetrate. Tetrate is a company focused on delivering secure traffic for application traffic for both API traffic and AI traffic. And I think my conversation today is going to be how uh, we look at privacy more from a real world, what we've seen, what needs to be put in place. It'll be less technical. It'll be more about how we are seeing that being used from our lens. My background is more um, into cloud infrastructure, security, networking. I spent some time in GCP, and then before starting this company, which is focused more on service mesh, Istio, Envoy, these kind of components, which some of you may have heard of. Um, I happen to have create some of these from my past at Google, but now actually deploying these more in the industry through Tetrate. So coming back to this topic, um, in the as people do more and more of service-oriented architectures, and we have more distributed and dynamic services everywhere, with a lot of data passing, and the whole AI momentum is only increasing the rate of apps getting created and the amount of data moving across network. Um, the risk of data breaches is just increasing, and uh, the intensity of regulatory regimes and regulatory gravity is also increasing at the same time. And as a result, it's becoming harder and harder for making sure that you are operating in a fully uh, trusted and privacy-proof world where your data is private, your data is not leaking out, you're operating in a way that you can prove to all the auditors that you are actually compliant at all the times to the regimes that you need to be. So as a result, it's hard to bolt it on, and I think it needs to be engineered into our systems. Um, so some of the things that need to be engineered is, I mean, these are, I think, the obvious ones. Um, in terms of data exfiltration, designing for data minimization. And people, I heard a couple of talks before on anonymization and minimization. Um, I think the second one is I see less of, which is um, having default access boundaries. And there's a very strong uh, UX versus security conflict here in the industry in terms of either I see too much of segmentation and zoning and firewalling happening, which is like to the point of uh, you know heavily dampening agility and UX, or it's come inside my trusted boundary and then it's free for all to the point of compromising security. So I think that see that challenge play out in various organizations. Um, the I think we need to strike a balance there, and some of this technology actually helps in that, where if you think more in terms of identities, policies, and encryption, where you untether yourself from sort of the IP and the networking constructs and think more in terms of identities, then you get you are somewhat resilient to your infrastructure movements. And that's something that many organizations are trying to get to, but are not yet there, and need a lot of help to get there. Um, uh, so I'll talk a little bit more about policies and encryption in the follow-on slide. So uh, there is almost in majority of places there isn't a concept of workload identity, which is a lot of people are for years have been familiar with user identity as a concept. Workload identity has in the last I would say, 10 years or so has gone from concept to projects to implementation to, actually being used in a few, at least a few organizations, but is definitely not like mainstream usage, where you can issue a cryptographically verifiable identity to every running workload and do it even for dynamic workloads of today, and then drive policy on top of that. So that's thereby untethering you from the network uh, oriented policy constructs. And that has huge benefits because after that, you can uh, have it in a way that yeah, once you centralize the um, issuance of policy and then you can make a distributed enforcement happen, then you can drive it consistently for your organizations in majority of places. You can drive it for acquisitions. It makes integrations of systems go faster. A lot of things that generally are otherwise very challenging for large orgs. Um, in terms of uh, trust levels, so that's the other problem. I think most people draw network boundaries of different kinds, and to the point that it's either, as I said, either hampers UX or is so far ingrained that it's very hard to debug and tell like who is talking to who and why was that access allowed of who's talking to who and who actually accessed that data that or service that they weren't supposed to access. And those are hard questions for most of the organizations to answer. In terms of source of leakage, a lot of companies use SaaS tools for observing what's happening, and they're often a big source of because of them not having DLP layers or organizations not being fully on top of like what's leaking out. They often become a source of how data leaks out. And the other big problem is heterogeneous systems with heterogeneous policy sources, and then not being able to like, what's driving where, and not having consistent policy and not being able to then answer which parts of my infra and apps are compliant to what becomes a big challenge. And those are actually often the biggest blockers to big projects like cloud migrations or acquisitions, integrations. Those things become the real issues. Um, so as I said, I was one of the co-creators for Istio project. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have. It's one of those projects that sits on top of Kubernetes, came out in 2017, and then has sort of grown in popularity from there. One of the key things that it brings to the table is the concept of workload identity and mutually authenticating every request for every service to every other service, thereby enabling encryption everywhere without any code change in any of the applications. That's by far the most popular, most desirable feature for the project since the last 8 years of its existence. And it issues a workload entity via a standard called SPIFFE, which some of you may know of, which is a secure provisioning identity framework for everyone. And more and more projects and companies have adopted it since the last 8 years. And the once you have identity, you drive policy based on that, which is declarative, uniform, enforceable, and ideally from a central system. And then if you bring in the uh, visibility on top of that in terms of uh, who is calling whom and where is what data going, and where is which calls are leaking out what data. And this is especially true now with so many of the AI model calls happening from different places to different models, with one of the number one concerns from security leaders is how much of this third party AI stuff should I allow versus not, and what's actually, how can I be made comfortable that this is all secure and not putting me in a compromising position. So it's kind of a challenge today. Um, in terms of uh, how to look at this, service mesh and projects like Istio and companies like Tetrate who have built platforms on top of it for zero trust and security. We have also written actual standards and SPs with NIST 204A series, 207A, both on microservice security, identity-based firewalling, API security, and so on that we've co-authored with NIST, which sort of define what the industry should be going towards. Um, and it can act as a privacy firewall where a lot of stuff can be done at layer 7, where you actually know what their requests are about, and therefore you can either grant or deny access. Redacting at the ingress point and between services, it's a common sort of a good strategy to make sure of not leaking data, or at least making sure PII is not going out. Um, Having your this one is the other big one, which is most people have a telemetry systems and the policy systems, and they're not connected together. So it's hard for them to like know that where uh, what policy led to what change and what metric, and it's a correlation exercise after the events, which makes uh, you know detection time and let alone resolution time like be extremely high. In turn, this bloats the operational cost. So um, there is a huge need for like centralized way of and centralized and correlated ways of policy and telemetry where um, you can sort of correlate them on the same timeline, which is what Tetrate tries to drive towards in their platforms. The other big one is the guardrails are built into these central org-wide uh, control and management plane systems, thereby not leaving it to the by chance, leaving it to chance or leaving it to the stroke of luck of like which app teams end up doing implementing it or not implementing it within their applications. And it is possible to have really clean central ways to manage, but distributed ways to enforce, along with real-time observability of like what's going wrong or deviating from what it's supposed to be, and knowing where that problem is, right? And these are, from what I see, most of the times is very, very hard in large orgs and is generally not in place. Uh, um, for among the many regimes, this is a common one where specifically you have keeping data local to where these services are running, and in specific geos, it's a and for specific types of services, it's a very strong requirement. Um, and some of the power of these technologies is you not just can you do mutual authentication, but you can do uh, full defense in depth by going all the way from, is this not just the service identity, workload identity, node attestation, and all the way to hardware, to basically like make sure that authentication is with full defense in depth, and then authorization overlaid on top is fine-grained to the level of like methods and data fields and protocols and so on. Um, a core kernel of this tech stack is the data plane, which is with this Envoy proxy, which is another popular project which Istio uses as the data plane. And it is fairly extensible to write a bunch of filters, and over the years, lots of APIs on top that can help in redaction, in writing WASM-based extensions or Lua-based extensions for data exfiltration checks, redactions, and so on. So uh, it's it's not as easy still to use as it should be, but there's a lot of extensibility in the design that you know for those with savvy tech teams, they are able to. Um, in terms of logging every action and having them logged to um, auditable sources, that's another big, huge challenge. Like who did what action at what time and changed what policy, and what did it result in terms of our telemetry is a huge challenge as well. And again, becomes easier when you build it into the core platform and infrastructure than doing it in silos. Let me pause for a second and see if there are questions. All right, I don't see any. Okay, keep going. Uh, all right, so uh, in terms of posture for zero trust, I think I mentioned two key concepts. Basically, having service to service auth N and auth Z at every hop. Usually, a good idea to bundle it with uh, use user facing auth N and auth Z as well. Typically, today they have been living in separate systems, but when you combine the two and check at all hops, you actually get a full zero trust posture for your application runtime, and which is sort of where our focus is. Um, the other thing is to have systems where you can have these policies being driven from a tenant level, where for each of the tenants that are onboarded onto the platform, you can drive policies and they can be put in force automatically. Um, and as I said, the key of the architecture is centralized way to do policy management, but decentralized way to do enforcement. And so, but having all the events and all go into a centralized auditable source. And we've seen that and helped companies get there with the rollout of platforms like this. The specifically when you, because there are different types of workloads in different companies with different tiers of acceptability for security and availability. So you need to do tenant and application level partitioning from those central systems so that uh, each type of workloads or teams don't end up doing their own thing. So those are the things. If that kind of thing is what Tetrate drives to make it privacy first, secure first, sort of as a baked-in concept by design into the platform, as opposed to a afterthought and a launch checklist flag that then you fight over, right? So just so keep it brief in terms of a few things that I can leave you as a message in terms of what to do as recommendations and as something you can take away and brief. Um, Encryption in transit and at rest always. Um, and that takes care of a lot of the uh, stuff that can happen with the man in the middle, and a lot of your uh, regulations and regimes actually this is at the core of, and it's really, really hard to achieve at large scale without technologies like this. Using standard identities and over IPs. IPs is becoming a little bit of a hard noun to latch on to, especially with distributed and dynamic containerized systems. And there are industry standards like this that you can embrace. And it is a good idea to get onto that bandwagon because you're future-proofing yourself, you're untethering yourself from infra, uh, and uh, you can drive it in a way that it will be portable. Third one I've mentioned sort of before. One is centralize the policies but externalize the decisions. So for those of you, if you're from authorization space, then you're familiar with naming and terminology like PDP, PEP, where your policy decision plane and your policy enforcement points need to be like cleanly separated. And so this is designed in a way where you can have central policy management from where you drive, you have distributed enforcement point, but you can externalize decisions and plug in your logic there for allowing or denying access. And last but not the least, you will have issues no matter how much precaution you take. You will have issues. You will need to eventually get into logs and debugging, and a big part of that is knowing the tenant and intent of from the logs than just like uh, a blind dump and then trying to debug what the tenant and intent were. So uh, auditability of what access decisions and what data exfiltrations happen through which requests because of which policy decisions is a fairly hard problem. And we've invested a fair amount of uh, you know tech and engineering to get to solve some of that problems. And if you're interested, obviously, we can go deeper into that topic. That itself is a fairly deep topic to get into.